Hello, my name is Sarah Lynn. I'm an ESOL instructor at the Harvard Bridge program at the Center for Workplace Development at Harvard University. I teach Harvard adult immigrant employees. And I'm also a curriculum writer. I've been involved in many series with Pearson ELT. And today I'm joining you and this webinar to sum up a little bit about what we talked about yesterday and build a link into what we're going to be doing today. So yesterday, I think there were some kind of central questions that various speakers and panelists spoke about, and I want to call those up. Denzel Muhammad really was addressing the first and primary question of who are the immigrants of today in the USA? What are they doing and how do they participate in our society? And his response was largely, let's look at the data. Let's strip away our cultural assumptions and lenses and just look at the data and see what is it telling us about the immigrants in our society today. Then Usha Tamalanara spoke about the psychological perspective of the immigrant student. She was asking, what do immigrants bring to our classroom? You know, their motivations, their stories, their families, their relationships, and their culture. Then Chiara Maggini started to talk about and brought us kind of to understanding ourselves as educators and how do we perceive our immigrant students? How can we identify their strengths and how can we listen better to their stories and who they are? She's really using the asset-based model to look at their strengths, recognize needs, but to look for the strengths and what they're bringing to us. And then finally, we had a panel with Celia Kallenbach and Claire Tash and Susan Rojas and Elaine Kugler. And in that panel, the kind of prevailing question was, in the classroom, how do we build on what students bring? Some of the ideas that came up with this were the culturally responsive pedagogy, so that students can bring their culture into the classroom and feel safe about it and honor their cultural identity. We talked about storytelling and how to bring the student stories into the classroom. We talked about a little bit about project-based learning and how that builds on what students are bringing and who they are. And finally, we talked about recognizing the connection of our students to their families and their communities and how students really are representing these worlds outside of the classroom and bringing them in. And in the K-12 system, bringing their families into the classroom as well. So that was yesterday. Yesterday was a framework. You know, who are the immigrants? What do they bring to our classroom? How do we recognize them and understand them? And how can we build classroom experiences that welcome their strengths? Today, we're going to be a little bit more practical. We're going to be talking much more in detail about project-based learning. And we're going to start off by talking about digital storytelling. So we're really going to be looking more at lesson planning. And with lesson planning, we need to keep a couple of things in perspective, I think. Often as teachers, and I've been a teacher for 27 years, it's easy when we get into lesson planning to think about the structure, the architecture, how we're building this, what we're doing, and all the things that we need to do to make the lesson plan work. And what I would like to offer today as a frame, as a guiding question as you go through your learning today, is what is the student doing? Let's keep a focus on the learner and keep our minds on the learner and try to think of everything that we're talking about in terms of what is the student doing? What is the student experiencing? Where is the student in this moment of this lesson? And the reason I suggest this is because I teach by, my first principle in teaching is learning begins with the learner. And I know it doesn't Sounds pretty obvious. Um, but it doesn't begin with the teacher or the classroom or the book. It begins with the learner. The learner has to engage in learning for learning to happen. Some of this perspective on learning, in my part, really comes from what we've learned from the brain-based research on mind and learning. And in that field, learning is really understood as a process of making meaning by connecting new information to previous knowledge. Right? So we all come with something, and the only way we're going to learn is by connecting this new information to what we are and what we know. So we have to begin with the learner. But this process requires some things that are sometimes a little uncomfortable. The first and most obvious thing is it requires risk-taking, because what we know is what we've kind of decided we feel safe about. And when we begin to learn and expand that our knowledge, we can feel threatened by change. We can feel threatened by different points of view. So one of the first pieces of this is to encourage risk-taking, and that also encourages resilience. There are different ways to do this. In my classroom, I tried to recognize efforts students make, and not so much whether they have a particular talent, but I recognize what they do when they work hard and praise hard work. It's also a way of not reacting negatively when there are mistakes, but always regarding mistakes and as opportunities to learn more. It's bringing a certain neutrality, I think, as a teacher, so that I'm not a praise machine as much as I am facilitating them and coaching them so that they can take risks and make mistakes and feel okay and try again. Another aspect of learning that I think is important to consider is that it takes a lot of effort. All right. I think as teachers, often we want to make learning easy, and we believe somehow if we make it easier, they're going to learn faster. Brain science is not true. It says the harder you work at something, the harder you think about something, the more time you take, the deeper and more real that learning is going to be to you, and the more robust your memory of that learning is going to be. So learning takes effort. Another part about thinking about learning, and learning begins with the learner, is that learning takes space and it takes time. To be an efficient teacher, sometimes we feel like, okay, well, I'll just impart everything and you'll get it and that'll be it. And then we can be done, and it's the most efficient model to have the teacher at the head of the classroom and the students listening. At times it is efficient, but it doesn't always actually lead to learning. For learning to happen, students need to be able to make connections. And for that to happen, they need time to elaborate on ideas, to retell what they learned, to make connections about what they learned to their own lives, to the world, to other texts and other sources of knowledge. It takes time to elaborate through speaking and writing. And that really happens when the students are speaking and writing, not when the teachers are. There's a maxim that whoever's speaking, whoever's talking is growing the most dendrites. So whoever's talking is learning the most. So as we think about creating a classroom that's learner focused, we need to think about how much time and space we're really allowing for students to be doing the speaking and the writing and the expression of learning. And that also means time to think, which means giving students time to say, I don't know, let me think, I don't remember, and just taking some pauses. And finally, the last thing I'd like to say about learning in the mind is that experience intensifies the effect of learning. So, really, we're multimodal learners naturally. If you think about young children, the way they move in the world, the way they touch and lick and throw things around and rattle and listen and probe, it's a multisensory experience. And a lot of the brain-based learning recently has reinforced that if we learn just through our ears, we remember a very small percentage. As we add vision, it's much larger. And when we add some kind of movement, it's even a better percentage of memory that we have for our learning. So we need to think about how learning requires risk-taking, it requires effort on the part of the student, it requires space and time, and it requires a variety of multimodal experiences. So if we're centering on the learner and we're focusing on the learner, what are we as teachers doing? Right? Well, we're kind of the architects, we're the designers. We're building the scaffolding and building the framework. And what we're doing is we're creating an environment for students to feel safe, right? We're creating the stage or the structure as a safe place for students to learn. And by creating that space for them, we're allowing them to contribute their knowledge and experience. And we're also really, I like the image of the stage because we're saying we're kind of building this stage for students to be the protagonists of their learning. So really, I think about the moments that I have seen the greatest success in my own teaching is the moments when my teaching is invisible. I really do believe that our craft at its best moments is invisible. It's the moment when this one student spontaneously exchanges a point of view with another student, or when one student provides really supportive feedback to another student, or expresses curiosity about another student's point of view, or constructively builds on what another student is saying. It's when students are asking questions, and not just a teacher, myself, asking them questions. And it's when they're directing their learning. So just to step back to my first thought, we can get, as teachers, very caught up in being the architects and this big building that we're creating, and we're carrying into the classroom our great kind of design. But really, we can get consumed and sometimes a little exhausted by that. And it's very refreshing to just remember the learner. And this is all about the learner learning. It's all about the question, what is the learner doing? So as you go about lesson planning today, just come back to the question, what is the learner doing? And therein lies the key to the student's success and to our success as teachers. Because learning begins with a learner. All right, thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's events, and we hope that you will give us feedback. We'll provide various vehicles for you to give us feedback later on in the fall, throughout the summer and into the fall, about what you've learned and what this has meant to you. And I would love to hear how this question, what is a learner doing, has shaped the way you think about your lesson planning. All right, best of luck.